The relationship between the body and mind is one with lines blurred. Whereas I undoubtedly speak to you now as a mind who had researched for this video, pieced it together into a script, and is now relaying the outcome, somewhere along the way of this intellectual process an aspect of my body would have played a role too. Maybe it was in occasional days of fatigue, or in subtle anxieties when trying to get the correct words onto the screen, or perhaps in the desire to discuss this dynamic in and of itself, like a type of bodily narcissism. No matter the direct link, everyone has their theories to the extent of one's influence over the other, and how that can be applied to one's life. Having always been the type to consider himself more slanted towards physicality than intellectual pursuits, revolving this channel around the latter has relied on lessons I've learned in the former. This approach is nothing new nor unique. Nevertheless, as I've read on, reading the likes of people who slanted in the direction of the body and others in the direction of the mind, I've come to notice a universal agreement when discussing the secret link between physicality and intellectual pursuits and/or artistry. To begin, I want to take a more popular example of this link, which can be found in Yukio Mishima's own quarreling with this relationship in his 1968 essay, Sun and Steel. By 1955, author Yukio Mishima had secured his position as one of the most prominent Japanese literary figures of the 20th century. Beginning his illustrious career with 1949's breakout autobiographical novel Confessions of a Mask, Mishima had thrown himself into the literary world and continually one-upped himself as the years progressed. As well as an ability to improve, he too displayed an ability for artistic transformation. He wrote novels, essays, plays, did a little acting, and even sang. He had a bloody good voice, by the way. Yet despite this, Mishima was not satisfied. Sure, the literary applause as well as the money was welcome, but he still felt there was something missing in his life that up until 1955 he couldn't quite put his finger on. The dawning of his discovery of this missing piece began in 1953 when he set off travelling the world. Having earned himself the monetary means to do so, Mishima travelled to all of the locations he had only hitherto visualised at his desk. He went to many countries, embraced many cultures, and he saw many things. But what became the prime source of his intrigue during these travels were the marble sculptures of ancient Greece. The craftsmanship of these sculptures is something to behold in and of itself. However, what truly caught Mishima's eye was the physical beauty of the physiques carved out of these marble-made men. Returning to Japan, he decided he needed to begin another transformation, but this time it would entail a completely different type of change, as he wanted to build his frail 5'3" frame into that of which he saw in Greece. In other words, Mishima wanted to get ripped. Thus, in 1955, Mishima began a 3-day-a-week bodybuilding regimen, as well as lessons in martial arts. It is said that he committed to this regimen up until his death in 1970. Within this 15-year span, Mishima transformed his body, realizing a whole new arena of individual potential, which soon led to a desperate need to discover the true link between mind and body. When he published Sun and Steel, Art, Action and Ritual Death in book form in 1968, he believed he had finally found the answer. Sun and Steel is a long essay detailing Mishima's relationship with the mind and body. He begins the essay describing his childhood propensity for words, and how his natural shyness and frail frame coaxed him into his darkened room where he would dedicate his spare time to reading and writing. Looking back on his childhood from an adult's perspective, Mishima concedes how his memories reach further back when distilled into words rather than physical action. He notes the sadness he feels as he admits this, as he believed himself to have missed out on a true reality at the expense of concepts. Mishima thought words to be corrosive. Articulation was a form of whittling down one's reality to a reductive abstraction that Mishima had been partaken in ever since he was a young man. This reductive abstraction, however, was not necessarily a negative observation, but simply an observation revealing a lack of balance. He viewed his mind-to-body dynamic as being like the white ants of words chipping away on the wood of reality. The words, however, preceded the wood. In realizing this, coupled with the inspiration of ancient Greek sculpture, he thus began the aforementioned training regimen. He describes the slow build of muscle through weightlifting as being akin to cultivating the garden of an orchard, with his mind represented as a dwelling. Mishima thus sought to utilize the Sun and Steel to raise this orchard to the level of beauty he had only successfully reached in intellectual pursuits. One day, it occurred to me to set about cultivating my orchard for all I was worth. For my purpose, I used sun and steel. Unceasing sunlight and implements fashioned of steel became the chief elements in my husbandry. Little by little, the orchard began to bear fruit, and thoughts of the body came to occupy a large part of my consciousness. Mishima wanted to reject the extremes of musings. The deep chasms of internalization or the lofty heights of contemplation both seemed too far detached from the wooden block of reality he had sought to understand. To him, he saw those who sought out these depths and or heights as fools. Whether up or down, taken to these extremes rejected the body's role in reality, and thus the legitimacy of the reality attempting to be defined by words. Thus, Mishima sought not to ascend or descend alongside his contemporaries, but to climb to the surface of the body where the sun reached its rays. Whereas before he had sought out the midnight contemplations as had every other writer, according to him, now he wanted his mind to follow in the direction of his body. The sun was enticing, almost dragging my thoughts away from their night of visceral sensations, away to the swelling of muscles encased in sunlit skin, and it was commanding me to construct a new and sturdy dwelling in which my mind, as it rose little by little to the surface, could live in security. That dwelling was a tanned, lustrous skin and powerful, sensitively rippling muscles. I came to feel that it was precisely because such an abode was required that the average intellectual failed to feel at home with thought that concerned itself with forms and surfaces. It is with this realization that Mishima's attempt at linking the mind and body got a few steps closer. He came to believe in approaching the surface and basking in the sun of a steel-like figure as offering a closer linkage of the two, as well as a more defined grip of reality. The body-to-mind dynamic had intrigued Mishima since his youth. He described days long gone where he would stand and watch young men collectively carry a small portable shrine through the streets during annual shrine festivals. Mishima studied the faces of the clear-eyed men struggling under the weight of this shrine in unison, many of them facing upwards towards the sky as if seeking additional strength. Mishima wanted to know what he saw in those eyes. In time he would come to understand what he saw. Suffering. Mishima believed the language of the flesh to be attainable through suffering, and in this instance, group suffering. It was in the ordinary man undertaking an extraordinary pain amongst a group of likewise sufferers, wherein a connection with death, the ultimate link between body and mind, according to Mishima, could be attained. Once Mishima had begun kendo and boxing lessons, this link became even clearer. He describes this link as appearing as if on the edge of a kendo stick or a boxing glove, an area wherein both action and consciousness collide in the common goal of flirtations with death. Suffering is the prerequisite. To embrace suffering is the constant role of physical courage, and physical courage is, as it were, the source of that taste for understanding and appreciating death that, more than anything else, is a prime condition for making true awareness of death possible. However, much the closeted philosopher mulls over the idea of death, so long as he remains divorced from the physical courage that is a prerequisite for an awareness of it, he will remain unable even to grasp it. Thus, Mishima believed he had come to find the link between body and mind in death. As death is something that can only be flirted with, he sought to exhaust himself to the brink, so as to get as close to death as possible. In doing so, he continued his training and developed his physique accordingly. He wanted to engage in a tragedy, which could only be achieved through the loss of something beautiful, his physical being. Yukio Mishima's theories regarding the body-to-mind dynamic were one of many you could find. However, whilst Mishima was attempting to articulate the potential of both domains of the human being, and how both could influence each other in a creative context, philosophers of the past have approached the body-to-mind dynamic from a more literal angle. This angle is known in philosophy as the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem is generally agreed to have begun with French philosopher René Descartes, who lived between 1596 to 1650. Descartes offered one of the first concrete theories regarding the mind-body problem in his book Meditations on First Philosophy, published in 1641, when he broached the theory of substance dualism, also known as Cartesian dualism. Substance dualism is the theory that the mind and body are made up of two substances. One, the mind, that experiences thoughts and emotions, and the other, the body, which deals with the physical realm. Our bodies occupy linear dimensions in space such as height, weight, length, and depth, whereas the mind doesn't. The mind is the mind. It occupies no space at all. Descartes saw this truth as being evidence of substance dualism. He is famous for the phrase, "I think, therefore I am," which acted as a sole self-affirmation of his mind's place in reality, a type of affirmation he felt unattainable by the body. To him, the outside of his mind was purely mechanical, and our minds were unique souls navigating this world. On the other side of the mind-body problem we have materialism, referred to interchangeably as physicalism, which in short is the philosophical belief that the mind and body are similarly made up of a physical substance. Despite these warring philosophical factions, both arguments are not 100% convincing. For example, if Descartes' substance dualism were to be correct, how does it account for the fact that our minds influence our bodies to move? How do you justify both as acting in entirely different spaces if our minds can make us lift a cup of coffee? Also, why can't we just enter any body? Why does it have to be our body if the realms are entirely disconnected? Descartes would counter-argue these points with his theory of the mind being trapped within the pineal gland, which is a small section of the brain located in the center. However, this too falls short, as ultimately, if this were true, the pineal gland is physical, and thus still doesn't truly argue for the direct influence of one over the other. As for the arguments against materialism, we would have to question the role of consciousness itself, and how you could chalk up our subjective experiences of thoughts and emotions into an objective rationalist perspective, such as materialism. These subjective experiences are known as qualia, and reference any subjective sensation, such as eating your favourite food or experiencing pain, ones that only you can experience. A famous example of a strong argument against materialism can be found in Thomas Nagel's 1974 essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, in which Nagel highlights the unattainability of understanding consciousness, particularly from an objective standpoint. Whereas the materialist point of view would rely on hard science for objective explanations, Nagel argues that you cannot apply this same rational approach to consciousness itself. The argument is further cemented in the title, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Answer, nobody knows or can know. We may understand the logistics of how a bat navigates the world, but we cannot truly understand what it is like. If we were to try our best to do so, we would only be able to go so far as imagining ourselves flying in the air, with our eyes closed, at best. We wouldn't, however, truly understand what it is like. But fundamentally, an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something that it is like to be that organism. Something it is like for the organism. How then could we ever explain the mind-body dynamic with a reductionist theory such as materialism? We can't, according to Nagel, as consciousness is simply a subjective experience far beyond our ability to comprehend in any objective sense. This argument against the materialist's explanation of the mind-body problem is not necessarily arguing for substance dualism either. Instead, Nagel is articulating the humble conclusion that we can never know. Consciousness cannot be understood, and by proxy neither can the mind-body problem, and thus it is only theories and opinion that dominate. Nevertheless, it is not controversial or argumentative to state the obvious fact that the body and mind, when both developed, influence each other positively. The ancient Greeks were massive proponents of finding a balance between the two. They believed in the interchangeable benefits of keeping both domains healthy, hence the healthy mind in a healthy body phrase. This too was evidenced in their sculptures, the ones that inspired Mishima. In an incredibly basic explanation, these sculptures represented the ideal body. With this ideal body, the man or woman on display was naturally thought to possess the ideal mind, a strong one. Socrates, Plato and Aristotle were all proponents of building both the body and mind. In the Memorabilia, a book that contains dialogues between Socrates and his students, there is a story shared in which Socrates approaches one of his students. Socrates thought this student to be in poor health and suggested that the man begin exercising. The student noted to Socrates that he was not an athlete, to which Socrates began a diatribe regarding this student's need to be in physical shape should war ever occur. He then ended his rant on this quote whilst playing up to the young man's vanity. Besides, it is a disgrace to grow old through sheer carelessness before seeing what manner of man you may become by developing your bodily strength and beauty to their highest limit. But you cannot see that if you are careless, for it will not come of its own accord. Looking at the other two, Plato himself, as well as being a philosopher, was an accomplished wrestler. The name Plato is thought to have come from his wrestling coach, who gave him the nickname. When translated, Plato means broad, suggesting broad shoulders. Lastly, Aristotle, like the other two, was a proponent of the building of the body and mind. However, where Aristotle differed was in his steadfast commitment to balance and harmony. For both excessive and insufficient exercise destroy one's strength, and both eating and drinking too much or too little destroy health, whereas the right quantity produces, increases and preserves it. So it is the same with temperance, courage and other virtues. This much then is clear. In all our conduct, it is the mean that is to be commended. The body-to-mind dynamic has continued to be celebrated into the modern age. Henry Rollins' 1994 short essay, The Iron and the Soul, or Kafiaka's Against Ordinary Language, The Language of the Body, both come to mind for short explorations of this theme. However, one notable example of a man who lived this full development of the perfect dueling ideal can be found in Mike Mentzer. Mike Mentzer was a bodybuilder who was professionally active in the 1970s and a tiny bit into the year 1980. He was the first person to ever get a perfect score at the Mr. Universe contest in 1978, that being 300. He individually fought against the IFBB, the International Fitness and Bodybuilding Federation, for wrongful practices, and he exposed many false prophets in the fitness industry with his high-intensity training method. In his short life, Mentzer wrote many books on his philosophy on training. Additionally, he trained hundreds of clients to reach their physical potential. He briefly trained the legendary 6-time Mr. Olympia, Dorian Yates. Mentzer prioritized objective truth when teaching and studying how to train. He did not simply believe what that year's Mr. Olympia had peddled in the magazines, but instead opted to study physiology and philosophy, incorporating both into his training regimen. The North Star of his research was logic. In Mentzer's time, information was scarce. Evidently, the internet wasn't a thing, and the industry itself wasn't as popular as you could argue it is now, leaving the most prominent voices to fall to a handful of muscle-bound men who, in Mentzer's view, were promoting counterproductive training methods in magazines, as well as overcomplicating simple matters in the name of profit. One of the most erroneous tidbits of misinformation being promoted was the method of high volume training. This volume fell both to the number of sets and reps, as well as the number of times you had to enter the gym within a week. The prevailing wisdom suggested a man and or woman should train 2 hours a day, 6 days a week, with sets that exceeded double figures. Mentzer had attacked this viewpoint with his method of high-intensity training, a training regimen founded on a philosophical foundation. He studied the works of Plato, and particularly his teachings on logic, when conducting this regimen, hoping to build a training regimen that not only produced results, but that also allowed for a life outside of training itself. High-intensity training is best articulated in Mentzer's final book, High-Intensity Training, The Mike Mentzer Way, co-authored by John Little. Put simply, high-intensity training is training till failure and leaving adequate time for recuperation. Instead of working out day after day, Mentzer believed that if you lift with intensity and until failure, the muscle will stimulate, and with enough time left between workouts for that muscle to recover, the body will grow. If you were to scratch your skin with sandpaper, over time your skin would grow back harder, if you left it. However, if you were to scratch your skin with sandpaper, and then scratch it again, and then scratch it again, your skin would get continually damaged. The latter half of this analogy is what bodybuilders of his era were essentially doing with their muscle. Day in, day out training was resulting in stagnation, which led to dissatisfaction, and then to quitting. To Mentzer, philosophy was the intellectual discipline that could be used to seek out fundamental truths in any discipline, including bodybuilding. The reason is because philosophy seeks to expose the laws of us as human beings, which is the first step towards understanding everything else around us. Mentzer took this mentality into his high-intensity training method and broke it up into multiple principles: identity, specificity, intensity, duration, frequency, adaptation, and progression. These principles need to be solidly established and to be as precise as possible to support the theory of Mentzer's bodybuilding method. In any theory of evolution or relativity for example, a set of principles is first distinguished before being used to support it. The 7 principles can be defined as such. 1. Identity, identifying the nature of the human body and its relation to the factor of stress. Number 2, which was intensity, which essentially anatomically and physically we are all the same. Despite our genetic factors, we are humans and therefore all react to stress in the same way. 3. Duration, which is that humans can only take so much stress for so little time. Therefore, there is a sweet spot within the application of stress that causes us to, after recovery, return stronger. Number 4. Frequency, essentially we need adequate rest to recover. Therefore, a person who truly wants to improve should not enter a gym 6 days a week, but instead 2 times a week with long rests in between. Number 5. Specificity. The body needs specific action to stimulate the growth. Number 6. Adaptation. The body will adapt to the stress we put it through if we give it time to. And number 7. Progression. As we notice ourselves improve, we will then be free to try harder, for example, heavier weights. Here is how they all compound together. In fact, all of the previous principles lead up to this principle. If human psyche, identity, only grows larger and stronger through the application of the proper training protocol, specificity of high intensity training, intensity, and such training in order to be of a high intensity nature cannot be endured for long, duration, or engaged in very often, frequency, it will lead to the body adjusting itself to the stress of the imposed training stress by a progression of adaptation, by enlarging upon its existing store of muscle mass. High intensity training has proven its worth as the years have progressed. Mentzer certainly had a point, even if he wasn't fully correct about everything. If you want a golden example of this regimen being applied, look to the aforementioned Dorian Yates. Whilst the big muscles Mentzer was helping people to attain was all well and good, his true goal was to help people realise their individual potential and push people to learn how to apply logic and philosophy to both their regimens and their lives. High intensity training was a proponent of this. For one, the nature of the workout itself whittled down the time in the gym from 3 to 4 hours a day, 6 days a week, to 30 to 45 minutes in a day, around 2 to 3 times a week, which allowed his clients to broaden their lives away from the gym so as not to become an empty-headed set of muscles, because who wants to be an empty-headed set of muscles? 2. The logical nature of Mentzer's regimen was influenced by Plato, as the regimen itself relied on physiological fact rather than mythic and or abstract myths pushed in the muscle-bound magazines of his time. Mentzer had studied the nature of logic so as to further his abilities as a trainer and by proxy as a human being. Bodybuilding is simply a more visceral example of the benefits that can be derived from applying this logic to your life. In the process of learning to think logically about bodybuilding, you learn something about the nature of thought itself, which can then be extended to other areas of life. And with continued effort and study, you'll soon make the delightful discovery that you've been developing your intellectual range and thereby maturing as a human being should. Lastly, high intensity training pushed you to your limit, and in doing so showed you how hard you are able to push yourself in a definitive way with definitive results. Lassitude, anxiety, and even a preference for low intensity workouts are manifestations of the mind's disinclination to engage the body in such maximal efforts. Therefore, as your muscles get stronger and stronger, you must exercise your will to get stronger apace. Having been successful in my efforts to become both muscularly massive and very strong, I can assure you that the principle of intensity refers almost exclusively to the human will and the ability to command your muscles to contract against the only real resistance, your own mind. Mentzer's philosophy stemmed from a desire to help people understand and reach their individual potential. To do so, he believed you needed a full logical understanding of the task at hand, along with the strength of both body and mind, the two of which could be built upon. However, if you are at the starting line of this attempt at achieving your potential, Mentzer says you should not become too bogged down by the what-ifs of your attempts, for our potential for something is only accurately determined after the fact. So, you may as well give it a go and do your best. In order to train as hard as possible, you must retain a clear image of your purpose. Once your goal is sharply but realistically defined, all that remains is carrying out your plan. Don't, however, worry about your individual potential. Potential is only the expression of a possibility, something that could be assessed accurately only in retrospect. In other words, you'll never know how good you might have become unless you try. The link between the body and mind is continually questioned, and it continues to be so in this video. As someone who has been a gym goer for the better part of a decade, I think the obsession over body and mind shouldn't be in the direct influence of one over the other, but instead in the lessons that can be applied to one another. Physical pursuits offer a visceral and objective series of progression that are not so self-evident in intellectual pursuits. The world of the intellect has its benefits, of course, but for me, I have always found it easier to apply the evidence of progression to my life when thinking back on a physically defined challenge. For example, when I prioritized cardio, week after week the length and or speed at which I could run continually progressed. It was undeniable. I was gradually getting better at something. Additionally, I was providing evidence of my ability for change, which is the most fun realization. In realizing this, I was able to apply that same progression to things like writing, or this channel, or even just reading. These intellectual pursuits are not always so obviously assessed in retrospect, Writing in particular can be hard to dissect for clear indications of growth. However, the sheer act of attempting to grow within writing can be spurred on through evidence of the physical pursuit, because you have the evidence that you can make a change. Physical exercise offers a black and white answer to a simple question. Can I run this far? Can I lift this much? Can I look like this? It's just a yes or no. On the other hand, the building of the mind through intellectual pursuits helps to lessen the burden you place on your body through maturation and logic. Since I toned down my gym sessions and prioritized recovery, I've made progress faster than I ever did when I was attempting to go 4 days a week for sessions that went on as long as an hour and a half. In slicing down this time, I ironically lessened the burden on myself of trying to exercise, but got stronger. 4 days a week can be hard to squeeze into a normal life, but now I have more time and less guilt between sessions, allowing for a broader scope of human experience, whilst also staying fit at the same time. For those looking to develop themselves in either of the two, just remember Mentzer's position on individual potential. We are all limited in our potential to some degree. Acknowledging where our genetics cap both physically and intellectually can sometimes feel depressing, because the reality is that not everyone can be Arnold Schwarzenegger, Mike Mentzer, Frank Zane, Steve Reeves, Dorian Yates, etc. Simultaneously, we cannot all simply start studying and become Stephen Hawking, Albert Einstein, or Nikola Tesla. But what we can do is improve and reach our own unique individual potential. Therefore, to do so, the best thing you can do is try. If you find some secret links along the way like Mishima did, then good for you. But if you simply found a hobby, then that works too. The point is to use both aspects of yourself as ways to push the other forward in whatever it is you plan to do. If you can do this, maybe you'll achieve things you never thought you could. You may finally reach your individual potential. You have maybe finally built the body and mind.